Okay, we move into our final unit test review and toward our final AP exam review. I'm recording 3 review podcasts for Unit 12. One is a review of architecture from the late 19th century forward. It includes a lot of test questions, but also some general background that we really didn't get to adequately in class. Please, I know that is a long podcast. I think it's the longest I've made for this course, but don't skip it. About a third of the questions on the test are on that podcast, and I'm not going to talk about them on this one. You really, really need to know the architecture from this period. It's clearly extremely important to the College Board. I'm also going to record a podcast on the general multiple choice questions for Unit 12, which we'll be taking a little bit later, but I'm going to put that up now. That's not as urgent since you're not taking that test immediately, but I actually think that if you have time for it, it would probably help solidify some of the information you need for the image-based test. There are 120 image-based questions, and you're going to have less than an hour. If you know this material, that is, if you've listened to the test review podcast, stared at the slides, looked up information I ask you to, you're going to be able to answer several of these a minute. A lot of them are very straightforward. Who's the artist? Where is he or she from? What school does this represent? I don't think it will take you that long. If you haven't prepped, well, you're listening to this podcast, so you are prepping, right? Okay. I am not going to go through the series of date PowerPoints that I have here for you. They're a reference. What gets ugly about this unit is we begin breaking down our dates by decades, and the dates are rough. Work by artist extends years on either end. Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, works through a large chunk of the period that we're looking at. Still, I think these will serve as a start. And so again, I'm just going to click through these quickly. I'm not going to go quite as fast as I might in case anyone who's subscribed to this wants to stop and get some kind of a screen capture. And now we get to our first work. This is an artist who turns out is very, very popular with the College Board. So you should know this artist. This is the guy who sculpts the metal cubes, or cubie, which is, by the way, something you'll need to know for your general multiple choice question. When did he work? And as is true for so much of this test, what you need here is a decade or a range of decades. What is this work made of? And I'll give you a hint, by the way. This guy got his employment start, if not his artistic start, working in an automobile factory and was very intrigued by those materials. Then comes a question that I did not prep you for adequately in my first lecture on the final chapter. I tried to fix that in my last podcast. This work exemplifies an important trend in 20th century art, which is known, rather unhelpfully to my mind, as formalism. So what does formalism mean? It doesn't mean that these are formal works that they put on a tux or a prom dress. It means an emphasis on artwork's visual elements rather than its subject. So, for example, on the paint, on the metals, on the sculptural form, on the effect of paint on canvas. And you're going to see that in your abstract expressionists. You're also going to see that in this kind of minimalist sculpture. It's an aspect of both, again, of both of them. And in fact, this artist had a strong influence on minimalism. So I just gave you an answer to another question. Note that the surface texture is created with steel wool, so it's burnished. It has some texture, but it still reflects. Note, too, the way this artist uses negative or empty space. So the sculpture is not just about the volume it takes up, but the volume surrounding it. And that's an important term to know throughout this course. So, do you see any classical allusions here? Any Nike of Samothrace? Nope. Are the surfaces painted? Nope. Is there any obvious narrative sequence? Nope. So, as you've probably guessed, you have an accept question, and what's left must be the right answer. I indeed think it's going to be easy to find the right answer from the image itself. By the way, never hesitate to use common sense. I think there are a lot of these questions where it would not be that hard to guess the right answer, even if you have absolutely no recollection of the work. So, don't panic. Stop and think. And I just gave you a whole bunch of answers. So this was the painter that I neglected in my podcast, and I've been trying to make up for it by including him on quizzes and telling you in messages that you need to know him. So I'm even going to tell you it's Jacob Lawrence. He's part of the Harlem Renaissance, and he portrayed a very important series of events, and that I am going to have you look up. You probably know the name of the series, by the way, gives it away. And then there's what I thought was actually a very good question, but a little tricky. How does he achieve a unified composition? This is an accept question. I'm going to go through the options. Does he use atmospheric perspective? No, remember, that means a blurring or lightening of color or a movement toward cooler colors as the background recedes. Does he use fumato? That's the slight blurring of edges that we associate especially with Leonardo da Vinci. These forms are very crisp-edged. Is it bilaterally symmetrical? In other words, if you folded it in half, either up and down or side to side, would the two sides be mirror images? No. But that's a little tricky because there is obviously some mirroring because you have a pyramidal triangular composition. But note that it's off-center and that it's an open composition. That is, it extends kind of past the frame. But note, he does use repeated forms. You see repeated triangles. You see the repeated birds, which, like the people, are traveling. So at any rate, I just gave you another answer. Now, this one's going to be easy for you. It's the usual questions. Who's the artist? What is the movement? What does the work allude to? What is the preoccupation of the school? College Board loves these guys, and these questions, for the most part, are easy. That is, unless you decided not to watch the rest of that podcast at home. If you made that decision, can I encourage you to revisit it? Okay, who's this painter? And by the way, the College Board likes to use this painter for general multiple choice questions as well. He's very distinctive. When was it painted? That's really a question about when the Post-Impressionists painted. And by the way, it's on your timeline. How did this artist's subject matter depart from earlier artistic conventions? I would just note that many of the Impressionists departed in the same way. I think he's quite easy to compare, for example, with Renoir. And in fact, I didn't include the Renoir questions again, but in one exam, this work is actually paired with a work by Renoir of a similar sort of subject. There is one tough question, although I did spend quite a bit of time on this in a podcast on Post-Impressionism. This artist is based on whose color theories? You're going to need to look up that name. I'm going to help you out. It's on page 883. Okay, this work was not in our textbook, and it was not in my podcast. I was a little startled, in fact, to find it on one of the AP-released exams. Our textbook actually came out just a year after this test, so I'm guessing that this painting appeared in an earlier version of Gardner's, earlier edition. Still, interesting work, and I thought I'd go ahead and include it in case it was revived in later editions that we don't have. The painter is Max Beckmann. The work was produced in the 1930s. He's associated with German protest art. George Gross is really the most important figure from the 1920s, Beckmann from the 1930s. That's, of course, the time when the Nazis are coming to power. In the next slide, I will show you the Beckmann painting that we do have in our textbook and which I could very easily see showing up on the College Board exam. So Beckmann was a German expressionist. Remember that. And by the way, expressionist is a very broad term. There are a lot of subcategories of expressionists. So, for example, the Mexican muralists are considered expressionists. Frida Kahlo is an expressionist. So you may have groups that fit into more than one category, expressionist and something else. You know the qualities of expressionists: strong colors, thick paint, bold outlines. The color is often used to express emotion, not realistically. You should recognize expressionism. At any rate, Beckmann was a German expressionist, remember that term, who was deeply critical first of Germany's Weimar Republic and then of the Nazi regime that succeeded it. So here's what the Museum of Modern Art in New York has to say about this work. They own it, and I find their website very helpful, as you know. Although Beckmann denied that departure carried any specific political content, the painting has come to be seen as one of the emblematic artistic responses to Hitler's Germany. It was begun at the time the Nazis fired Beckmann from his professorship at the Frankfurt Art Academy, and it presages his forced emigration. Departure is the first of Beckmann's several major paintings in the form of a triptych, a three-part format that recalls medieval or Renaissance altarpieces. Indeed, the elaborate narrative juxtaposes scenes of sin and salvation. But what makes the painting modern is the deliberate ambiguity of its iconography. In plain English, we really don't know what this painting is saying. You now have all the information you need to answer the 4 questions about this work, but I just can't resist exploring a little further. So, here's the Beckmann painting you have seen next to the Departure. And here's another comment on Departure from an art blog. Because Departure was painted in Germany at the time of the Nazi takeover, and because Beckmann later fled to Amsterdam after his works were included in the Nazis' infamous degenerate art exhibition, this triptych is often understood as the artist's response to an era of blind conformity and sadistic violence. Well, on one level, this political interpretation must be accurate. It fails to account for the surreal strangeness of the work, and I agree with that. If Beckmann had wanted to make a statement about Nazism, he could have conceived images much more pointed and effective than a fairy tale king in a boat and a blindfolded bellhop holding a large fish. This is, after all, the same artist who in The Night, and I've shown that here, 1918 to 19, gave us one of the 20th century art's most brutally direct images of torture. And you might recall that Germany really descended into chaos after World War I. There was a revolution that was put down. Eventually, a democratic government came into power, but artists like Beckmann were very critical of what they saw as the corruption, particularly the financial corruption of the leaders of Germany. So the central panel is a place of peace, open, stable, unthreatening, a place of possibility, a world away from the side panels where sadistic games are played out in cramped, enclosed theaters of cruelty. In the right panel, we're literally in the theater, watching a woman with a lamp walk across the stage while roped to the upside-down, half-naked corpse of a man who has been stabbed between the shoulder blades. Across the triptych on the left panel, in a torture chamber decorated with columns that refer to traditional depictions of the flagellation of Christ, a man tied to one of these columns has had both his hands cut off. In the foreground, a woman whose torn clothing suggests she has already been raped is bound and forced to kneel over a large crystal ball. So, remember Expressionism, torture, Nazis, 1930s, and Max Beckmann. I could actually very easily see The Night appearing on an exam. So you need to know the sculpture on the left. It's in your book, page 1018, in the section on organic sculpture. But as you might guess, when you see its date and Italian name of the artist, Brancusi, oops, I just gave it away, is usually classed as a futurist. The organization of that chapter and the proliferation of isms makes delivering this material complicated. The sculpture on the right is identified for you here, and it's partly identified on the exam. It's identified by title, as, by the way, is the sculpture on the left. I believe it's Flying Bird. I think I might have that wrong. Oops, anyway, you can look it up. By the way, this is Marcel Duchamp's brother. He died very young during World War I. And here's what the Art Institute of Chicago has to say about this work, which they own. Writing in 1913 to his friend, the American art historian Walter Pock, Raymond Duchamp-Villon declared, "The power of the machine imposes itself upon us, and we can scarcely conceive living bodies without it." It's a very futurist sort of sentiment. That year, the French sculptor began his preliminary sketches and clay studies for horse, progressively abstracting these initial naturalistic renderings. So he began with drawings of actual horses, of the animal's anatomy, into a coiled configuration of geometric forms, suggestive of pistons, gears, and shafts. Optimistically embracing the clean aesthetic and dynamic potential of the machine, Duchamp reinterpreted the traditional subject of equestrian sculpture for the modern era. Note, by the way, that the Bauhaus school and the Futurists like machines. They talk about clean machines or machines for living. Other of our artists, the Surrealists, the Dadaists, for example, are much more skeptical of the industrial age. So the questions on these two works focus on the role of abstraction. What purpose does abstraction serve? Which is actually a question you should think about. Does it completely disguise what is being sculpted here? Does it disguise a bird? Does it completely disguise a horse? Or does abstraction, in fact, heighten the meaning of the work? I'm guessing you can guess the answer from that. But think about this particularly with regard to the sculpture on the left. I mean, is everything about a winged bird? Has all of that disappeared from that sculpture? I don't think so. Both sculptures are bronze, by the way. That's a traditional material, but they still represent a response to modernization. And that is a pretty big hint for one of the questions. The next two paintings go together, so you need to be able to give the art historical period or ism for each of them. You'll recognize each painter, right? The College Board actually identifies this one as Mondrian, but then asks questions about his intentions for his art, which get a little complicated. Mondrian was very philosophical, even spiritual. He followed a philosophy called theosophy. And what your textbook says about his style is that Mondrian believed that it revealed underlying eternal structures of existence, underlying eternal truths, and gave viewers access to these universal truths. Note, he was not a Freudian. These were not dreams. I think this quote is very helpful, and actually it will specifically help you answer a couple of questions on the test. How it will help you answer? Well, those underlinings came from me, not from the College Board. In fact, this quote is one that I found. Here's the other image that's paired with the piece you just saw. Know the artist. These are very distinctive. You could get any number of works by this artist. They're all titled numbers or untitled or something like that, so it doesn't really matter. Know the school or ism. The approximate dates when both of these painters worked in their different periods. One is pre-war, one is post-war. That is World War II. And the reason why each painter embraced abstraction is these quotes indicate both think that their paintings carry great meaning, but it is metaphorical meaning, not representational meaning. In other words, you're not seeing a picture of something. The truths that Mondrian is seeking seem more universal, more abstract, based in geometry. Rothko is searching for a more personal and psychological truth. So the title of the work on top is Autumn Rhythm. You should recognize the artist and know the technique he used to paint this and similar works. What earlier 20th century painter really pioneered the creation of purely abstract painting? You need to know that one. Think of the nexus between music and painting. This guy's a real College Board favorite, as is the artist of this painting on the left. The work on the right is not in your textbook. And I don't think the College Board expected you to recognize the work, since they tell you right off that it is a room-sized sculpture by Judy Pfaff. Pfaff. In other words, it's a kind of work called an installation. I just gave you an answer because I'm not sure if I used that on my podcast. And boy, we were going through some of those last works mighty fast. So what kind of work is the one on top? There's several possible answers you need to know. There are descriptions that really refer to how these paintings are made, and then there's the ism. Only one of those will be on the test. In what decade was this style most commonly produced? Again, I also have that on your timeline slides. Think about what the works have in common. Note the experiment with different materials, lines, colors, and the energy and spontaneity of both compositions. In some ways, I'd say Pfaff's installation is almost a 3D Jackson Pollock with fabric instead of paint. I don't know if she tossed it around or splattered it, but it has kind of the same feel in 3 dimensions. At any rate, I can't hint much more broadly than that. Note also that both Pollock and Pfaff are formalists. That is, they're preoccupied with the physical properties of paint and canvas, or in Pfaff's case, the lines, colors, and textures of fabric, rather than a specific subject matter. So that's something else they have in common. Okay, you need to recognize both of these artists and the guy on the upper left I just talked about or made reference to. And yes, the painting on the bottom is different from the quite similar painting on the previous slide, but same artist. You need to know the artist. You won't need to know the title, but you again do need to know the time frame. Both of the artists on the bottom, and it wouldn't hurt to know the time frame of the artist on the top. I will just tell you, he too is an interwar artist, that is between World War I and World War II. So what group does the artist on top belong to? You need to know the term both in English and in German, or at least you need to be able to recognize the German term on a multiple choice test. It's not hard. How would you classify both works? And the answer is going to be another term for abstract. And I'm going to give you a very broad hint. Representational art represents something. You can identify the object being painted or sculpted. So what would be the opposite of representational? Very broad hint. What elements do they have in common? I think many of these will be quite clear in the form of abstraction, use of color, all over design. But what have the painters not attempted to portray that painters have been trying to do since the Renaissance? I included that Perugino painting on the upper right as a hint to the answer. So remember that the painter on the upper left thought that his colors were connected to music and that both music and his art had a deep spiritual significance. It's important to remember that the term formalism or formal elements again refers to the shape, color, paint qualities, etc. Formalist art then focuses on elements instead of representing a particular subject. So again, by definition, these are both formalist works. So here's another installation of sorts, but it's actually in a piece of environmental art by installation artist Nancy Holt, who's the wife of the guy who did Spiral Jetty. And you need to know who that person is. And you need to know some other terms for this kind of art besides environmental art. Should be easy. The sun tunnels are cited to relate to the sun at the summer solstice. So what other work that we've studied does that? And I have made your life very easy because I have included a photo here. Okay, here again, you need to know these two artists by name, and you need to know where they come from and the movements with which they are associated. And you need to be careful with that last part. I'm going to give you a big hint about the work on the right. The movement includes the name of the city where this artist works and a description of what he and his friends wanted to do with regard to the art establishment. This artist was also heavily influenced by what much earlier kind of art. Think lots of gold. So, the artist on the left, what historical movement does he come closest to? I think this is a hard question. This artist is surprisingly early. You'll see him on the timeline. Not as early as Impressionism, but earlier than you might think for a work that is as expressionist and sort of somewhat abstracted as this one. His paintings have a surrealist feel, but surrealism won't come until after World War I, and this is actually a work from 1893. So, what late 19th century school focused on inner vision rather than outward reality? And I'll just tell you right now, that's also one of your general multiple choice questions, so you need to know. And I'm going to give you another big hint. Henri Rousseau is often considered to be a member of this group. By the way, you'll get even more of an answer if you watch the general multiple choice question podcast. So what are both of these artists interested? By the way, it's a big preoccupation in Klimt's hometown, and especially a big preoccupation of its famous local hero, Sigmund Freud. And what term would be applied to both artists? And this is a term you need to know. The answer is it's a general term that is derived, in fact, from a military term that means a scouting team that's set out ahead of the rest of the troops. So from that, you should be able to get it. It's also a French word to really help you out, especially if you know a little French. And now we get to have some fun. So, and everyone should know this one. What movement do these works represent? And when did these artists work? Think early Beatles, guys. From where did the artist on the left appropriate his images? I'm pretty sure you could answer that even if you'd never seen the work. What does this look like? The artist of the work on the upper right is who? And what is he obsessed with? Here's a question I didn't prepare you for in my already too long podcast, so I'm going to give you the answer. The Marilyn Monroe work is made with the medium of photo silk screening. So the artist is borrowing technology as well as themes from modern culture. This is basically one where the photo is placed on a screen and then ink is dripped through the fabric. There's some serious advantages to this method. Prints can be made quickly. They can be easily reproduced, so you can make a lot of them. They can be made with assembly line speed, and they're very profitable. The artist could charge a whole lot of these for these, even though he could make many of them. However, this technique does not produce highly realistic detail. If you've gotten this far in the podcast, you just got an answer. Finally, what do we call a work with two panels? The word's in the title, so you can look it up, but you should also remember the term from altarpieces. Okay, here again, you need to recognize both artists, and you need to recognize the work on the right, which is probably the single most famous Futurist image. Unique Forms of Continuity in Space by Umberto Boccioni, dating from 1913. I just gave you a whole bunch of information. By the way, for this unit, an Italian name usually means that you have a Futurist artist. The other Italian sculptor you need to know, for example, is Brancusi, who made that wing-like Bird in Flight. Oh, that's the name, Bird in Flight, which is really both a Futurist and an organic sculpture. Boccioni's work is much more machine-focused. There's a memory device, a mnemonic device that helps me remember Boccioni. I don't know if it helps you, but he sculpts movement. Bocce balls move. Maybe that's silly. It helps me. The Futurists were a movement that flourished just before World War I. That should help you with the dates. Remember that they were keen on the cleansing power of war. Many of them volunteered, went off to fight and die in that conflict. Boccioni, sorry about the dogs in the background. Boccioni died in 1916 while serving in the army. I'm going to get up. No. He did not die gloriously. He fell off his horse during a training exercise, was trampled, and died the next day. Now, the mobiles or kinetic moving sculptures are unmistakable. You should know that artist. In fact, I'm going to be really generous. I'm getting to the end of this podcast. That is Alexander Calder. This one is called Lobster Trap and Fishtail, and it dates from 1939. It's not a work I think the College Board expected you to know, since they give you the title. Calder worked through the 20th century, so that I noted that the College Board did not ask for his dates. That's probably why. So why are these two works paired? What do these artists have in common? I'm thinking you'll probably be able to guess, but I'm going to help you out again. They're both obsessed with bodies in motion. Remember that terms like motion and speed show up all the time in questions about futurism. By the way, both sculptors would also be considered modernist. That's as opposed to postmodernist, or more traditional in the way that, say, Rodin was. Calder died, by the way, in 1979. Boccioni, as I mentioned, died in World War I. Last slide. So who's this artist? Again, very likely to be asked to identify the artist from a painting using his technique because it's so distinctive. What kind of a subject was he painting? This is really a question asked about two of his paintings. What's he doing that, say, David would not have done? What earlier school of painting strongly influenced this artist? And by the way, this is very easy. The artist was a post-blank. In other words, he was strongly influenced by the group immediately before him, the group that fills in the blank. You've got that answer now. Well, as I said at the beginning, I have left out a good third of the images that will appear on the test because they are on my architecture review podcast, which is longer than this one, but really important, not just for this test, but for general AP test review. I'm now going to move on to recording a podcast on the general multiple choice questions on the exam. You may want to put off worrying about that for now, but I think it might help you solidify your knowledge for this image-based test as well. At any rate, good luck.